Hello everyone, welcome to Messages Matter, how to communicate effectively to help end violence against women. My name is Georgie Bradley, I am the media officer and a spokesperson for the agency, and I will be moderating this webinar today. As I'm sure you can appreciate, given that we are an agency that's focused on gender equality, violence against women is a topic very core to the work that we do. We collect data on the different forms of violence against women. We support the implementation of crucial legislation to combat it, as well as driving communication campaigns around it, which in the age of information, where messages spread like wildfire, this is a really good thing, but also quite a tricky thing.
Recording in progress.
Of course, it's good because of awareness raising, but it's tricky when disinformation is packaged in such a way that it can convince you it is true. Therefore, every message matters, which is what we're here to talk about today. How do you combine rigorous research with powerful communication strategies to shift beliefs and behaviours? So the aim of the webinar is to equip communicators with how to use ethical storytelling, values-based messaging to help end violence against women, both online and offline. We're going to explore that continuum as well in the conversations. So we have in-house experts here today who are going to unpack our new workbook, How to Communicate for Change, as well as pivoting over to external experts who have on-the-ground experience in cutting through that noise to affect change, including legislation. So there's so much that we're going to get through, and I'm sure it will take you quite a while to metabolize everything, but not to worry, this will be on our YouTube channel. But just before we quickly begin, this webinar is followed by an interactive workshop. So for those of you who have joined us on Zoom, please pop your questions, any that you may have, in the chat, and we'll get to them during the Q&A. If you are following us on YouTube, you can also pop your questions in the chat. If I don't manage to get to your questions, not to worry, we will respond to you later. So, good, we begin. I will start off with Christiane Rosbach, who is the communications team leader at EIGE. I want to start off by sketching some background. You've led the development of what is the Comms Lab, which has culminated in this new workbook. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired this initiative, what the workbook aims to do, and what you hope communicators will take away from it?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question. The Comms Lab that we developed is actually kind of a response to what we're really seeing in the world. And as you mentioned, Georgie, communication about gender equality is really everywhere. We see it in social media, we see it in the news, we see it in daily conversations, and it's not always easy. We do see a lot of progress, but what we also see is backlash, and this backlash increasingly fueled by disinformation. So we knew that we needed to come up with a new approach and to keep up with the changes that we're seeing. We want to really be able to set the tone and lead the conversation and not just react to it. So we set out on what I like to call a journey. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't just sit in a room and decide to write up a guide, but instead in 2023, what we did is we decided to really focus in on one key gender equality challenge, which is violence against women. And then what we did is we listened, we experimented, and we learned from others. So we did, within our means, some social listening to see what people are saying out there. We tested messages with different audiences. We brought together experts and peers to share what works and also what doesn't. And one thing became very clear. Communication is not that simple, and there's no one-size-fits-all. So that's why the workbook is also not a set of instructions, but rather it is a set of thought starters, I would say, and questions that are adaptable to different contexts. And in line with EIGE's focus and our agency's focus, what we're doing as well is provide a bit of evidence throughout the workbook. What I hope people can take out of this is be more confident in telling the stories that really matter, handling tough conversations, and also pushing back against negativity and against the misinformation that we're seeing, But most of all, I also hope that it really inspires us to see ourselves as part of a bigger community that is growing together and that is communicating together.
You mentioned that there's no one size fits all, which of course is a very valid point to make, but the workbook does emphasize values-based messaging and ethical communication. Why is this so important when addressing violence against women?
That's a great question, and it's, I think, really at the heart of what we do. So when we talk about violence against women, what we need to know is we're not just sharing facts. We're really shaping how people feel and think about a really deeply sensitive issue. And that comes with a huge responsibility. So by leading with values such as respect, empathy, and honesty, we can build trust and we can make sure that messages help and do not harm. And I think that's where really ethical communication comes in, and why it matters is because we're really dealing with people's lives. We're dealing with their experiences, and we're dealing with them in an environment that is more and more filled with mis and disinformation. So we need to really be intentional, or we risk that we're giving more space to harmful narratives. And that's why in the workbook also we have a bit of a short checklist which encourages all of us to pause and to ask a few important questions, I think. And one question that really stuck with me was, would a survivor really feel seen and respected by this message? And I know that this will be one question that will guide our work at EIGE, at least, moving forward. Will this really be something where people feel respected and seen? And yeah, I think that's also why I'm so excited about the workshop today, because we're joined here also by young content creators. And I just want to say, your voices really matter. They're really powerful. And what you say and how you say it can really shape what people feel and what they do next.
Thank you so much. So you've covered a lot of the feeling, the storytelling, the narrative arc, which we get to Gareth a little bit later on. But I want to turn to Dr. Jessica Doyle, who is one of our gender-based violence experts here at EIGE. Your contributions to the content of this workbook was really important because evidence strengthens communications. As someone who is on the side of research, what are some of the key challenges when it comes to discussing evidence around violence against women, and how does the workbook help to overcome that?
Thanks, Georgie. I think one really major challenge is that research on violence against women is both highly sensitive and politicized. So we have really strong evidence across Europe that violence against women is widespread. So in terms of recent evidence, the 2024 EU Gender-Based Violence Survey, which is a pan-EU study carried out by Eurostat, by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, and by EIGE, found that across the EU, 1 in every 3 women and girls over the age of 15 had experienced violence. So we know that violence is really prevalent. However, evidence on the prevalence of violence against women is still routinely questioned or distorted or used selectively. And this is a really key challenge that we face. So I think sometimes this is unintentional. So for example, taking research out of context or not paying enough attention to the context, but it can also unfortunately be intentional. One prominent example that we see, and that I think we are increasingly seeing, is the use of research, for example, violence against women prevalence statistics, to spread misinformation about certain groups. And one thing that the workbook does is it seeks to address some common sources of disinformation, and it helps us to develop useful counters to them. Another kind of key challenge relates to the emotional nature of violence against women and girls. So we know that violence against women is not just a set of statistics. It's a really profoundly painful experience with really long-term and very serious consequences. So we need to find a way to communicate that, but at the same time to avoid sensationalizing it and to avoid re-traumatizing. So again, here we hope that the workbook helps to address these challenges, helping to create this kind of bridge between evidence and understanding. For me as a researcher, I think in particular, it's a really good reminder of the importance of how we communicate as well as what we are communicating. So I think that that's really, really valuable. I think in a large part, the value comes from this kind of pairing of data with values, motivation, but without sensationalizing, and above all, centering survivors of violence against women.
Yes, so as you mentioned, amplifying survivor voices with dignity and care is something so crucial to communicating effectively, because these are people's lives. As you mentioned, this is pain. How can communicators ensure that they are amplifying voices with dignity and care? Very concretely, how can they do that?
I think that's a really, really good question. And it's one that I think a lot of people who work in this area will kind of grapple with and think about a lot. I think here we can really learn from research. So in research, engagement with survivors of violence against women and presenting their experiences guided by really strict ethical principles. So for example, informed consent, confidentiality, voluntary participation, essentially approaches that kind of minimize the risk of re-traumatization. We also know from research and also from survivor-led organizations that clearly representing the agency, the dignity and the strength of survivors are hugely important when it comes to communicating their stories. The workbook, I think, tries to really center the importance of ethics and survivor-centered communication. So, for example, in terms of practical tools, it provides an ethical checklist and a guide to the use of visuals and images that highlight the agency, the recovery, the empowerment, but don't sensationalize. But at the same time, don't minimize the violence. And I think this is really, really important. Essentially, I think it's really important that research and communication are both guided by a set of ethical principles and a trauma-informed approach, which prioritizes safety and empowerment.
So you've now entered into the more practical elements of the workbook, which is great, because now I'm going to move on to Gareth Morgan, who's the content director of Restless Communications, who is the personification of messages matter. Perhaps you can tell us a little. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what that stands for. What makes a message about violence against women powerful and persuasive in today's digital landscape?
Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And some of the figures that we're hearing here are truly staggering, you know, really upsetting stuff. But it's important to recognise that stories also have power, and if they're the vehicle to bring these statistics to people, then we need to use them with care. We must be fast and loose with them. So hopefully, within the workbook, we'll give people the tools that they need to help tell those stories when they're out there spreading the message about how we can change things for the better. Or it should be zero, as the sweatshirt says, around gender-based violence.
Representing. So the workbook talks about the problem, solution, hope, narrative arc. Can you share an example of how this structure has worked effectively in a campaign?
Well, I mean, I think I'd like to say, come back in 6 months and I'll tell you how successful this has been. But look, the structure is really important, and we will talk through how to get that structure right and to build a structure. We'll talk about narrative arc and show people how they can actually use that in whether it's writing a 280 character post for social or a 100-page white paper. It's always the same, you know, that simple narrative arc. But knowing the structure allows you the freedom to actually be yourself within communication. And we look at what's happening in New York. Look at Mandani. You know, he's being his self in that communication. It's having real power. So it's yes, it's structure, but it's also telling your story, and hopefully the tools in the workbook will help people to do that.
So do you have for someone who understands through and through this structure and understands its power, but they have writer's block? What can trigger something to just get on the paper?
I don't know if I've ever told you about this, but I mean, what I do if I've got writer's block is I go and put some very loud music on my headphones and think of something entirely different. Because quite often we live our lives sat on a keyboard and staring at something. And sometimes for that creative process to kick in, you need a change of state.
Yeah.
And that change of state can be something, your brain will continue thinking about it, but just go out, do something else, think about something else, and come back to it when you're ready.
Everyone has their process, left, right, and center. No way is the right way, but as long as you're going the right way, if that makes sense. Okay, so we're going to go from the inside out now and get connected to our external experts, who should be there. If I can introduce them just verbally first, we have Susanna Pavlou, who is the director of the Mediterranean Institute of Gender Studies. We have Dr. Sylvia Semenzin, who is a senior researcher in AI forensics, and we have Emil Ludvigsen, who is a special consultant for the Centre for Digital Youth Care. Do we have all three speakers with us? If not, I can go straight to Dr. Sylvia. Okay, I'm going to jump over to Dr. Sylvia, whose research focuses... hello. Hi, Susanna. How are you? Hello.
Hi.
Actually, I'm going to start off with Susanna first because that kind of works with my narrative arc here today. Hi, Susanna. So, jumping in with you first and foremost, from your extensive experience in working across policy and advocacy in cyber violence against women and girls, among many other areas, how has the digital landscape changed the nature of gender-based violence, and what are the most pressing challenges confronting this space right now?
Well, thank you for the question, and also thank you for the invitation. I'm really very pleased to join this discussion. And it's a huge question. We often say that the online world simply mirrors the offline one. But for girls and young women in particular, it has become, I would say, a new front line of gender-based violence. It's faster, it's more public, more permanent, in many cases, much harder to escape, yeah? And in our work, we've also seen that the digital environment is not just a backdrop, right? It's part of the problem itself. So it's not just a space where gender-based violence sort of plays out, but it's also part of the problem. So the way they're designed, the way they're moderated, the way they're monetized, that sort of actively shapes the conditions in which abuse happens. So I think the first major change that we've seen is scale and speed, right? A harmful message, an edited image, a rumor, it can circulate to hundreds of thousands of people within seconds. What once might have been a private incident is now sort of accelerated, it's archived, it's searchable. And young women and girls know this, right? Second, we're not only seeing old violence in new spaces, in sort of in the digital space, but new forms of violence entirely. You know, deep fakes, doxing, cyber stalking, a big one, which is a massive concern, particularly to young women and girls, is non-consensual image sharing. AI-generated sexualized content and so on. So technology hasn't just sort of moved violence online, it sort of innovates, it has innovated gender-based violence. And I think the third thing is that there's no longer any clear boundary between online and offline life. So when we talk to young people, I think something that we tend to miss, that we don't notice perhaps, is that for us, for those of us who are old enough, perhaps, we have maybe a clearer demarcation or a clearer boundary between the online and offline world. For young people, though, you know, WhatsApp, TikTok, Instagram, gaming platforms, these are their social worlds, right? So, and these boundaries are completely blurred. So harm follows them home, into school, into friendships, and even disrupts their sleep patterns, their health, and so on. And perhaps I think one of the most concerning shifts is normalization. In our work, girls have told us that, you know, harassment, sexual pressure, image-based threats feel routine, right? Not because they accept it, but because they don't believe anything will change if they report it. So that resignation is really a very strong message that we are getting from young people, and I think that in itself is a form of harm. So I think the biggest challenges we face are impunity. Young people are telling us that reporting is pointless. Either nothing happens or or they feel in the end that the online world or the digital platform will side with the abuser. So there's a real erosion of trust and silence around gender-based violence in the digital world. I think another thing that we need to address is the digital environment itself. And I sort of touched on this before. Online and digital violence, digital environments are not neutral spaces, right? So they have manipulative designs, they have targeted advertising, they have sort of pornified aesthetics, the algorithms, algorithmic systems. I mean, these shape how we experience the online world, right? And our exposure to gender-based violence. So I think we really need to look at those ecosystems that perhaps produce and exacerbate vulnerabilities and how violence sort of grows inside those ecosystems. So I think what we're dealing with today is not a lack of awareness, because I think really we're past that. I think there's a very acute awareness of online harms. I think what we have is policies are trying to catch up with this sort of very fast evolving online environment, and what we're lacking is accountability.
You've been involved in developing prevention measures and educational programs, so you have a lot of first-hand experience talking to young people in schools. What are they saying? What are you hearing? What is happening in this landscape that you wouldn't know unless you spoke to them firsthand, which you do?
Right. So, I think that's sort of key. And I tried when answering the previous question, sort of share what we're hearing from young people and particularly young girls themselves. And I should say from a very, very young age. I mean, it's quite. I think it stuns us when we discover how girls as young as sort of 12, 13 share what they're being exposed to online, which they describe as hate, as hostile, degrading, and so on. So I think it's important to start with what doesn't work, right? I think we'll start with that. And what they're telling us is that it doesn't work to tell girls to stay safe online, right? It doesn't work to blame them for sharing an image, right? It doesn't work to do a one-off, and we hear this really often, a one-off workshop or lecture in October and feel that we've covered the topic, right? Even in my own children's school, every year, I receive an invitation to join a seminar or an event or a lecture on cyberbullying, and it's given by the same representative of the police or the Ministry of Education with the same content, the same material, right? Yeah. And it definitely doesn't work when adults minimize online abuse as sort of drama, or as an overreaction, or part of teenage behavior. I think what we're really feeling is that there's a sort of gap between how young girls and boys experience the online world and what they're hearing from adults, right? They have this feeling that their world is not understood. And so, as you said, they want to be heard, right? So when we've done things like focus groups, they're like, well, this is what we want. This is what we want. We want to talk. We want to discuss. We want to share with you what we're experiencing. Yeah. So in our conversations, young girls will often say, okay, yes, the violence is bad, but, the silence around it, the lack of understanding and the lack of awareness, not from our side, we have awareness, but the lack of awareness on among the adults around us, whether they're teachers or parents or what have you, that's worse. Right? That's worse it can be worse than the violence itself. So they want adults who listen, who believe them, who act, and not adults who tell them to block someone, right, and move on. Because they particularly around, I mean, there's a lot of anxiety around image-based abuse, this non-consensual sharing of images, that this is permanent. that it will never go away, that it will creep up and it will creep up on them at some point in the future. So they really feel this sense of anxiety, and so it's not enough to just sort of report, block. So what would prevention look like? And I think we really need to, I mean, I've got more sort of, we need to design prevention programs around sort of gender transformative digital education, where we're not telling them what to do, like don't post, don't click, don't, it's, to build understanding and skills around digital consent, about how humiliation is used to control girls, about how algorithms shape what we see and how we feel, about how boys bond over this content, about peer pressure among boys and this sort of peer dynamics among boys and how we can interrupt that. I think we need to focus more and invest more on sort of youth-led and peer-led, peer-based approaches, rather than these sort of top-down solutions like us as adults, we come and we talk to you. I think they really want to take this sort of, to have ownership around solutions around this.
Can I, Susanna, if I may stop you there
sure.
just for a moment, because we're actually going to go deeper into image-based violence and talking to young men and boys. If I can just flip over to Dr. Sylvia, who is a senior researcher in AI forensics. Your research focuses on tech-facilitated gender-based violence, and I think we need to address the most rapidly evolving technology, as Susanna had also mentioned, AI, artificial intelligence, and how it's related to gender-based violence. Can you give us some examples of how AI is used for sinister purposes? What are they and what is the impact?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with you. So some of the elements that I'm going to discuss were already put forward by Susanna. But I'm going to expand a little bit based on the research that I've been doing in the past years, especially looking at the case of how platform affordances are today entangled with cultures of misogyny and, in general, technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So already back in 2018, when I was researching specifically Telegram, there were already bots, for example, bots or applications for nudifying women without their consent. So I'm going to start here because I think sometimes we think that AI is bringing new problems, but actually they have been around for a while. What is changing is that they are increasing. So when AI started to become more popular, so there was like this boom of generative AI and everybody started to discuss it and download it. There was also a boom in some of the forms of gender-based violence, such as the AI manipulated images, also known as sexual deepfakes, that in the past years have grown, according to research, more than 550%. So it means they are exponentially growing. And today we find them into bots. We found them sometimes into applications that we can find on our Apple Store. We can find them online, into webs. And this type of violence is affecting primarily women. Of the 96% of all the deepfakes that exist online, of all the deepfakes existing online, 96 are sexual, and 99% are having women as subject of the representation. So it means it is absolutely a gendered violence, and this is a real issue. It is something that we should really think of as a severe problem, because I think that since we're discussing also about how to communicate regarding technology facilitated gender-based violence, I think we should also understand that AI and the digital in general for a very long time have been considered as not real violence, as something that it doesn't have a consequence on women's life. And actually it has, because deepfakes, for example, have the same exact consequences on women's life than survivors of image-based sexual abuse of their real images. Then I would like to point out that there are other forms and emerging violence that are around right now with AI. So When we think of AI, another myth that we should maybe deconstruct is the idea that the real problem or risk of AI is that it will gain a conscious at some point and dominate us as a sort of Terminator, right? This is what the tech savvy or the big tech want us to believe. But the risks are already here. The problems are already here. And it's not about Terminator, it's about all the harm that it can do, especially to marginalized communities and women, using AI to harm, control them, and humiliate them. This is the case, for example, on how AI can intersect with the already existing violence, for example, harassment, for example, doxing, for example, disinformation campaigns that today are becoming more popular and also more easy to put in practice thanks to automatization. So we can also find them into digital platforms, not just into fringe forums or niche of the manosphere. There would be many others that I could list. I will list, for example, algorithmic misogyny, the one that we're seeing today into the digital platform, censoring feminist or survivor voices while amplifying voices from the manosphere or misogynistic voices, because as Susanna was saying today, misogyny is profitable, is something that it's becoming imitable as well from many teenagers. So it's becoming more viral, while survivors can see themselves censored or even attacked more. Then we have AI, sexist AI, for example, giving rise to sexist influencers, sexist chatbots, AI fabricated porn using non-consensual material, immersive reality shaping new types of violence, such as the so-called meta-rape, and so many other forms that should just let us think that the more technology we create without any kind of feminist thought, the more this technology can be used against women. So we should act before. I think that we should really reasoning on how to expand the feminist digital justice to AI justice, because AI is shaping new frontiers of gendered discrimination and violence. And in this regard, we should think of survivor-centered definition of arms, consent-based governance of data and AI, and then transnational and cross-sector cooperation.
Before I ask you the next question, you mentioned so many different forms that I've never even heard of. Out of all of those, or maybe you didn't mention some of them, which one should we be most concerned about as an emerging form that we need to know about sooner rather than later? I'm not saying things like doxing, even I know what that is. Aspects that we don't know yet. What should we know at this point?
I really struggle to decide which one is more harmful, because I think they all are, and also we have to think that this type of violence never come alone. They tend to come intersecting to each other. But if I had to pick, I would say AI manipulated content, and then I would also say sexist and misogynist algorithmic of big platforms, because they are really shaping right now the public opinion regarding feminism and regarding women, and it's really risky for our democracies to let these platforms, vehiculate sexist discourses and hate against women, because it's what is happening right now.
I want to focus in on one of your success stories. You were instrumental in the campaign Intimità Violata, which lobbied for legislation against revenge porn. And you did it. It's now law in Italy. What lessons did you learn about mobilizing public support for this to happen? Because I imagine you had to speak to everybody, from politicians to the media to schools. What did you do to make all of this happen, to put all of these moving parts together to now be enshrined in law? What was that process?
So I have to say, first of all, well, thank you for the question and for the space regarding also this campaign. I have to say that it was another time, for maybe it was not too long ago, but it was still 2018, 2019. So it was before the pandemic and maybe before all this anti-feminist backlash that we are now witnessing. But this said, I think some of the challenges and the learnings that I have during the way are still valid, in the sense that I was operating in Italy. Italy, as you might know, is a very patriarchal context and with a lot of misogyny. So it was not easy from the perspective of a young woman that I was at the time. Also from a survivor perspective, having my voice being heard, and be taken seriously as a feminist, because I was at the very beginning of my work. I was starting to do research at the same time. So the work that I did was trying to blend my research to communicating it out and try to have an impact on institutions. At the beginning, the campaign started with an online petition that we launched on change.org. So I was also mixing digital elements with then offline elements, more traditional elements of political campaigning. The petition went viral. It also got some support from politicians in Italy, so that allowed me to at least starting to talk with medias and starting to gain some attention regarding the problem. The biggest difficulty was also shifting from the individual to the structural, let's say, because media are also trying to look for the story, for the survivor story, to have all the details and unpack it to find your faults. So that's when I did the Telegram research to show that the individual was irrelevant when you had structural problems such as 60,000 men sharing pictures of women without their consent. And I would say that that research was the one vehiculating more interest from the political perspective, because that took me to actually discuss a law together with Laura Boldrini, who was the former president of the chamber in Italy. So, and she was a feminist. So we started to discuss what elements should have been included into a law. Then, as it happens in Italy, everything is way more complex than this, and politics can be very tricky. So in the end, we arrived to one article, not the full law that we wanted, but because it wasn't so easy to have, feminist laws approved immediately. And also, the only thing that I want to highlight was also how I learned how much hostility you can gain for being a feminist publicity today, and especially in Italy, because even if the campaign was successful, I received so much hate, so much bullying, so much harassment online, that for a long time I decided to step out. And then after the pandemic, I went back to doing advocacy, etc. But I would like to mention it in this space, because sometimes we think it's easy as a feminist to get laws done, and that's not how it is. And I would say that this hostility has increased over the time. So yes, happy to discuss it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And it's the positive and the negative. You're trying to change it, but it's also chasing you at the same time. You become a victim of it as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was so insightful and so inspiring as well, even with all the challenges. But, these things are never straightforward. I'm going to move over to Emil Ludvigsen, who is a special consultant for the Center for Digital Youth Care in Denmark. And we're going to touch on the manosphere algorithms and going deeper into working with young men and boys. So you work closely with young people, particularly young men and boys, who engage in online communities filled with misogynistic messaging and ideas, which can often be packaged in ways that promote health and well-being. Like the shop front is quite misleading. I'm really curious to know, when you engage with young men and boys, how does their offline behavior differ from the online behavior that we see?
Luckily, for the most part, it differs quite a lot, at least for the majority. So as some of the other experts have already touched upon, a lot of the content that you get online as a boy or young man is very misogynistic, coming from the manosphere, advocating. It might be violence against women. It might also just be promoting some narratives that might then in turn make violence against women seem like a good option or less serious than it actually is. But then, of course, when I go out and visit these different schools, high schools, whatever, and talk to boys and young men, of course, most of them have a pretty good idea of how you can be a man or a boy in a good way. They have quite a good idea of how a good partner should be. They might actually also most of them support the fight for equality. But the issue, especially here, is that there are some people who perpetrate this kind of narrative, and then a very large, very silent majority. So if we just take the context of me visiting a school and talking in front of all 160, 300 pupils, whatever, I don't pretend to be able to catch the one person who might in the future commit a form of gender-based violence necessarily, but more so trying to reach the majority and make them understand the role they can play in the future in stopping this kind of violence at a party, or standing up for what they believe in, standing up for the girls in class or the women at the party, and try to take a more active role so that the girls and women who are on the receiving end don't have to take the fight alone. So it's sort of those two different things, offering a better way of thinking about masculinity to the few who might be straying away towards the manosphere, but also making the majority believe that they have a voice in fighting for the equality of girls and women, and that we also have a lot to gain as boys and young men in participating in that fight.
Silent majority. I'm just kind of picturing you in front of a hall full of students who maybe don't want to be there, they're not so interested. How do you approach them to participate in discussions about masculinities? How do you even present what masculinities is in a way that's not like a teacher? I would imagine you have to have a very different approach if you sense that there is some pushback. How do you open up to them, and how do they open up to you? Can you give us, if it's appropriate, some examples?
Yeah, well, sure. We're all very aligned in this webinar today in aligning ourselves with feminism, intersectional feminism, declaring ourselves feminists, all these different things. But I have to understand, when I go out and try to move boys and young men just a little bit more towards feminism, that I don't necessarily reach a good conclusion if I start out calling myself a feminist. Even though I would like to show that support for the cause of feminism and gender equality, I have to understand where is my audience right now, and where do I want them to be in just an hour or an hour and a half. And I can't get them to go from one idea of equality and feminism that the manosphere has sort of told them through a couple of years to our understanding of feminism. So it's better to just call it what it actually is, talking about freedom of expression, democracy, fundamental democratic rights, and so on, all the things that feminism actually encompasses, but try to avoid using that word. So that's one thing I do. I also extend them the olive branch that what makes this difficult is that for the 150 plus years that we've fought for women's rights, we have maybe actually forgotten to also work a little bit for the rights of boys and young men in a way that now positions them in quite a bad place in a lot of different areas, including, at least in Denmark, education, health, a lot of things where boys and young men fall behind. So I try to serve it from the perspective of what can you gain from also actually seeing yourself as a feminist or fighting for equality. And then I have a whole section just talking about masculinity, where I sort of very explicitly tell the girls that now I'm just going to be talking to the boys for 15, 20 minutes. Feel free to listen along, but this is actually not for you. Which I don't say before the presentation. It just suddenly appears within the slide deck when I already have made them laugh a couple of times, made them understand that this is also about them. And I think also, unfortunately, it helps that I'm a man, and I'm a fairly young man at the age of 29. I've been doing this for 6 years, because I have been doing talks where it has been me doing a presentation, and then just after a young woman or a woman trying to talk about these things as well. And I can sense that the boys and young men immediately disassociate, or they might even pull out their mobile phones and start playing a video game as soon as the other person goes on stage, because they might have had enough of women telling them that they're privileged or how they should be manly or masculine. It might be better that it's that it's someone from the same in-group as themselves.
You mentioned they might pull out their phones and start scrolling away and getting a bit disengaged, but then engaging in the algorithm. I want to briefly talk about the algorithm which favors the furious and rewards rage. Anything loud enough that gets clicks suddenly becomes a very dangerous trend, which tends to be associated with misogynistic content. I want to know from your perspective and from what you've heard from young men and boys and girls for that matter as well, what effect is this having on young people?
It's having the effect that we see a larger polarization between the genders, because of course the algorithm makes sure that each of us gets exactly the content that we want to see more of. But apart from the just individual algorithm, there are also very large differences between girls and boys, for instance. So when I highlight some of the narratives that get fed to boys and young men during one of my workshops, that is also the first time that the girls actually get to know some of the content that the boys are getting on TikTok and Instagram. And it's the first time where the boys are then able to watch and see the reaction of the girls when listening to Andrew Tate or some of these other actors in the manosphere. So that's the issue right now. And also we have begun seeing, unfortunately, some teenage boys, young men within the school system beginning to express more violent views, talking about their female co-students as unclean if they've had a sexual experience, if they're not virgin, or saying that they don't want to receive education from women teachers, or after homeworking class, whatever you want to call it, after doing cooking within the setting of middle school, they'll say that the girls have to clean up and do the dishes after they've been cooking. So some of these very early signs of something that might then later develop into gender-based violence have become earlier and earlier in the conversation that we need to be having with boys and young men. And I think that a lot of the reason behind that is the algorithm on TikTok and Instagram. And one final point is that we actually see a bigger, or we see less support in the fight for equality among young men than older men, which is a little bit counterintuitive. It should be getting a little bit better from generation to generation. But now if we talk to a teenage boy, his grandfather might actually be supporting equality more than he is, which also points us in the direction that maybe the manosphere content, the algorithm, plays a big role in the polarization between genders, especially in the fight for equality.
So I want to ask, as a parting question open to anybody, pivoting on the raging nature of the algorithm, which is moving at speeds that we cannot keep up with. How do we take control of what feels out of control at the moment? How can the algorithm be tamed? Whose role is it? Presuming that this is the role of many. So anybody who wants to answer that question with a concrete, this person or this body or schools or whoever, whose role and responsibility is it to rise up to the challenge of catching up with the algorithm and stopping it in its tracks before it becomes even bigger than it is already?
I think I could pick up, Georgie. The trouble with algorithms is they're a black box.
Yeah.
We often don't know what's gone into them. We don't know what's happening underneath the hood of the algorithms, and the only way that we can see that by shining light in there is through legislation. So it's really something that comes at an EU level, and the EU is looking at this, and I know that they've had success in the past with things like GDPR and legislation. They've kind of led the way in the world. However, that world of the algorithm is moving so fast that we really need to get our skates on, and any help that organisations like EIGE could do to oil the wheels of progress would really help on that.
Thank you so much. If anybody else wants to chime in on that, we have about 30 seconds left, or I can park this and we can go into the interactive workshop. Would anybody like to add something? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for your thoughtful insights, your incredible experience. I'm sure we're going to extend what has been said today in the interactive workshop. Thank you so much. We've got so much to metabolize from the classrooms to the algorithms. You can play this webinar back whenever you want. It's going to be on EIGE's YouTube channel. So thank you so much and see you next time.